I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation, the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe, who died in the cold on the lawn of another Boston police officer who was never investigated because prosecutors charged his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Here's the story. On the night of January 28, 2022, Boston police officer John O'Keefe and his girlfriend, Karen Reed, visited two bars in Canton, Massachusetts, C.F. McCarthy's and the Waterfall Bar and Grill. Later, they proceeded to an after-party at the home of fellow officer Brian Albert. Reed dropped O'Keefe off at Albert's residence but did not enter the house herself. The following morning, concerned by John O'Keefe's absence, Reed, along with Jennifer McCabe and Kerry Roberts, searched for him. They discovered O'Keefe unresponsive in a snowbank outside of Albert's home. Despite attempts at CPR, he was pronounced dead at the hospital. An autopsy revealed blunt force trauma and hypothermia as contributing factors to his death. Prosecutors allege that Reed, intoxicated, struck O'Keefe with her SUV and left him to die in the snow. Reed maintains her innocence, asserting that O'Keefe was attacked inside the house and that she is being framed. Her first trial ended in a mistrial, and now it's time for the retrial of the century. We're getting ready. It's about to start. But let's talk about that morning. There was a lot going on in those early morning hours, including this storm that was rolling into town, which is one of the reasons that everyone went out on that Friday night, because they knew the next couple days things are going to be canceled. We're not going to have to be running around picking up the kids to do this or running out over there. Everyone's going to be kind of locked in their homes, shoveling their driveways, and just kind of staying homebound, which is one of the reasons that everyone was kind of saying, hey, let's go out on this Friday night. So let's take a look at that morning. And there is dash cam video from the first responding officer that captures some of the activity, and you can see the people that are there at the scene. This is very close in time to when John O'Keefe's body is discovered on the front lawn of 34 Fairview. Let's take a look. And you can hear some of the screaming, and you see the bodies and the people running back and forth. You think about the chaos of the moment, right? You're dealing with the wind, the snow, the cold, the dark, and now you've got this scene, and everyone is besides themselves. And you see Karen Reed running back and forth. I mean, John O'Keefe is dead on that lawn. With all of this going on and the people who are responding, you can see and sense the level of, it's frantic, what is going on. But it's also difficult dealing with some of the elements and being able to even see what was going on. Now, you're seeing a bunch of people going back and forth. I have a freeze frame that I want to show you of who's who on the scene. If you look, you've got Kerry Roberts, you've got Jennifer McCabe, and you've got Karen Reed. So all three of them arriving together at the scene where John O'Keefe is found lifeless on that front lawn. And that brings us to the first question in our investigation. What is the connection between these three women? What's the connection that morning on why they are together that morning? And how about beyond that? How well do they know each other? How are they connected? What are their relationships like? Because we know that the two women who are with Karen Reed are important witnesses for the prosecution. Here with us to try to untangle all of this, a YouTuber, author of the book Storm of Suspicion, the Karen Reed trials. Kevin Lenahan is with us, and Karen Reed supporter and creator of the Justice for Officer John O'Keefe and Karen Reed Facebook page, Nick Rocco. Thank you both for joining us. And I think this is such an important question. for the jury, obviously, for figuring out the truth, and also for people who kind of know the story but don't know the story. And you two know it as well as anyone. Nick, I'll begin with you. What's the connection between those? Why are those three women together that morning?
Well, the friendship was between John O'Keefe, Jen McCabe, and Kerry Roberts. Karen didn't have any of their phone numbers, so earlier that morning, John's niece had to call Jen McCabe to find out where John was, what was going on. I believe Karen was the one that called Kerry as well. So when Karen left that morning, she was on her way to Jen McCabe's house. And when she got there, Jen ends up, they basically all end up going back to John O'Keefe's house. Kerry Roberts meets them there. They all end up getting in the same vehicle to go out and look for John O'Keefe that morning. And then in that still frame that we saw, you see Karen frantic because, John O'Keefe is lying there on the lawn. Jen McCabe and Kerry is there as well. But the connection and friendship really didn't lie between those three. The connection that Karen would have to those two there would be through John.
I want to play some testimony from Jennifer McCabe talking about that phone call that Nick just spoke about.
At some point, does the defendant get on the phone with you?
She does.
And what, if any, conversation do you have with her at that?
She proceeds to scream my name multiple times, and she tells me that John didn't come home, they got into a fight, and that she left him at the waterfall.
And then what, if anything, did you hear once you were downstairs?
Screaming.
And where was the screaming coming from?
Out front.
And when you heard that screaming, where did you go?
I ran to my front door.
At some point, did you open your front door?
I opened my front door, correct.
And then what did you see when you opened your front door?
Miss Reed came running up my walkway. It was more of the, Jen, did I hit him? And then she would yell, did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And then she was yelling, we have to go to Fairview.
All right, Kevin, these are obviously really important witnesses because they're with the accused murderer at the moment they find John O'Keefe's body. From your perspective, Kevin, why do you think jurors should believe their testimony?
Well, Nick did a good job outlining the relationships there. I could just fill in a few of the blanks, too. So John's niece, who he had been raising for 8 years since they had been orphaned when the parents died, his sister, John's sister, was best friends with Jen McCabe's daughter. And they still are, best friends. Kerry Roberts did not really have a connection to the McCabes or the Alberts. She'd only met Jen McCabe once before, so there was no connection there. Kerry Roberts is an old friend of the O'Keefes, a lifelong friend, basically, of the O'Keefes. And that morning, in fact, she's the one that goes and picks up Mr. and Mrs. O'Keefe to bring them to the hospital. And Kerry had perhaps the most powerful testimony in the case because Karen had called her up at 5 a.m., woke her up and said, John's dead, and then hung up, and then called back a few seconds later to say, John, something's happened to John. Maybe he's been struck by a plow. Well, that testimony was corroborated by the fact that right afterwards, Kerry called up the Canton police to see if they had found anybody injured and then called up the hospital. And that evidence was introduced in court. And in addition, the defense chose to not cross-examine Kerry Roberts, which really, it would have been very difficult to try to paint her as part of some kind of conspiracy. So, Kerry is an extremely credible witness. That's something people should keep an eye on.
Nick, from your perspective, it was clear to everyone, Jennifer McCabe does not like Karen Reed. From the way she testified, it was very, very, it was obvious to me, right? And I never spoke to her. I never spoke to Karen Reed about anything like that. That's just the vibe you get. From your perspective, why do you think the jury should question the credibility of Jennifer McCabe and Jennifer Roberts? Well, Kerry Roberts.
Jennifer McCabe, Jen just comes off very hostile. If you didn't do anything wrong in this situation, no matter what people accuse you of, there's no really need to be so defensive. And I think her body language speaks a different tone than what the words she's saying is. And I know she blames it on, Alan Jackson creating this campaign smear against her. But there are basically, when she was testifying the whole time, she wouldn't just answer a question. She wanted to make sure she could see her prior testimony, whether it was in the federal grand jury or it was the state grand jury. She wanted to make sure that what she said on the stand lines up exactly to what she said in a previous situation. So if the truth lies within you, you don't need to remember what you keep saying, because it's always the truth and the truth stays the same. So the fact, I think, that she kept having to check back to see what she said before was a little suspect in my opinion. Now, Kerry Roberts, I believe, she is a very good friend of John O'Keefe's from long time ago. I don't believe that Kerry really said much that hurt the defense. I don't think they didn't not question her because they couldn't rebuttal her. I think it was more because she's probably the only sincere one that got up on the stand. No matter what she said, she's probably the only one that was sincere about this whole situation.
Kevin, how would you describe the dynamic between these three women that morning?
It's hard to know what the dynamic is. I know, people have rivalries and stuff like that. There's no evidence that there was any kind of rivalry here. Jennifer McCabe's anger, as Nick just talked about, is completely understandable. Here she is. She's a witness. She voluntarily hands over her phone. And in order to get their client off, this defense team has used some of the most scurrilous attacks on her and on her family and on her daughter, and it's been nonstop. And so anybody would be angry. It would be inhuman to not be angry to watch what had happened here. And so, Alan Jackson going up on the stand to try to take this outlier information to suggest that she's making this search at 2:27 when all the other evidence and all the best experts in forensic data in the world have debunked it, that it didn't happen. You can imagine how she feels, though, to have this guy up there who's like a car salesman trying to make her say it out loud. And so her anger is completely understandable. And Kerry Roberts was a huge witness because there's no innocent explanation for Karen calling at 5 a.m. and suddenly believing that John is dead. Why doesn't she believe that John's just lying on a couch or still up drinking? She had no reason to think that John was in any danger. But yet somehow she woke up at 4:30 after taking a nap. Did she go and look at her taillight in the garage? I think that's probably what happened. And she started to put it all together and she panicked. And there was no way to in any way impeach the credibility of Kerry Roberts.
All right. You guys are going to stick around. We've got more to get to with them. But coming up next, what role will John O'Keefe play in the retrial?
Johnny was unbelievably generous. He was unbelievably loyal.
Is Karen Reed a killer girlfriend?
She's guilty.
Or the scapegoat in an elaborate cover-up?
Karen Reed was framed!
Karen Reed is accused of murdering her police officer boyfriend.
And stated repeatedly, I hit him.
She may end up taking the stand. Her first trial ended with a hung jury.
They haven't proven anything.
Will a jury finally agree on a verdict?
We know who did it.
The Karen Reed murder retrial. Live coverage starting Monday morning on Court TV.
Johnny was unbelievably generous. He was unbelievably loyal. Again, as John Jackson had mentioned, once you're in Johnny's orbit, you were there permanently.
He also was taking, one of his fellow police officers to cancer treatment, and no one ever knew. No one ever knew. He just never would do things for his friends and never ask for anything in return.
Of course, there are some of the friends of John O'Keefe. He's the victim in the case. Now, from my perspective, understanding John O'Keefe, all I had to hear was the story about what happened in his family, the family tragedy, where his sister passed away and his brother-in-law passed away within months of one another. And he jumped in and said, I, as a single man, as a single father, are the shoes he's stepping into, I will raise those children. He's a Boston police officer. That's a tough job. Raising two children, that's a lot tougher. I mean, that's really tough. By yourself. Not easy. But he did it. He did it. And that spoke volumes to me. The first trial, the dynamic was strange because in many of the murder trials we cover here on Court TV through the years, a lot of times the defense will do something to go after the victim, right? You know, the victim did something wrong, or there's something about the victim that they do that makes the victim, you know, can upset people connected to the victim. But this defense team didn't do that. The only thing that they've done is said, the person you've charged with doing it did not do it. Someone else did. So this wasn't a case where the victim was on trial. But the victim almost disappeared, because when you go to the courthouse, you have hundreds of people there for Karen Reed, but you didn't have numbers for John O'Keefe. I think second time around, things are going to be different. Take a look at this. We found some billboards that have now gone up to support John O'Keefe. This is in Dorchester, which is in Suffolk County, and Walpole, which is in Norfolk County, where all this is being tried. You know, remember him. And I think that's important for the family. But from my perspective, it brings me to another issue, another question in our investigation tonight. And it's about the victim, John O'Keefe. What role will John O'Keefe play in the retrial? And when I say that, what I mean is the testimony, the remembering him, humanizing him, everything about him, how is that going to be manifest itself in this trial? Because in the first trial, yeah, sort of, but not really, right? If you watched it, you know what I'm talking about. Here with us, Massachusetts trial attorney who served as special trial counsel to Johnny Depp in his defamation case, Wayne Dennison, and Massachusetts criminal defense attorney Joseph Krowski Jr. Great to see you both tonight. Joseph, what are your thoughts about John O'Keefe in this retrial? Will there be a different sense of John O'Keefe? Because I felt like he got lost to a certain extent.
I agree with you. Look, this trial is not just about the death of John O'Keefe, right? It's about the life of John O'Keefe. And somewhere along the way, that got lost in the first trial. Perhaps the government trying to navigate its way through disproving the conspiracy theory. There is, you know, the ability for the Commonwealth to humanize John O'Keefe. And certainly that was part of the first trial, but I don't think it was consistent or sufficient. Now, again, there's limitations, and the judge is going to instruct the jury that they don't base and decide this case on likes and dislikes or on sympathy. And there are limitations on making appeals and trying to elicit visceral reactions. But certainly, I don't think John O'Keefe was sufficiently humanized. To your point about those billboards, certainly I think the thing that's going to change in the second trial is the gag order and the buffer zone. Certainly there was what I would characterize as exploitation of John O'Keefe during that first trial. Regardless of whether or not you think Karen Reed is innocent, if you're holding up a picture of John O'Keefe and espousing justice for John O'Keefe, then you should not be heckling John O'Keefe's mother or any of his family members. So, and again, the anecdotes that you did hear were very positive for John O'Keefe. Conversely, when you heard those voicemail messages from Karen to John, there was a palpable difference in the tonality and the temperature of that case and of that trial.
Wayne, I want to show you some video from inside the courtroom, and I thought this is significant. That courtroom is small, and the O'Keefe family was there throughout, and where they're sitting, I mean, that's what the jury can see them. Like all day long, they're very close to them. It's very obvious who they are, and at other parts of the trial, they were there with some of the state's witnesses. So I think from that perspective, John O'Keefe, at least his family to a certain extent, it became very clear who they believed was responsible. So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it is a very small courtroom. I've tried cases in that courtroom. You're very close to the jury. The jury knows exactly what's going on. Obviously, the jury will see the alignment between the O'Keefe family and the prosecution. But ultimately, John O'Keefe isn't on trial here. John O'Keefe is an incredibly sympathetic victim. And yes, they're going to humanize him, and they're going to make every effort to humanize him. But in all candor, the relevance of his very, very strong and very human tendencies is really low when you get to the question of whether or not Karen Reed killed him.
And it makes this trial different. It makes the trial different. In most of the murder trials that we cover on Court TV, there is something about the defendant's actions or things that he's done that become very not the defendant, the victim's actions or things that he's done or said that become very relevant in the case. And that's not really here. It's a guy who went out drinking and got out of a car. And that seems to be all of it. We only have about 30 seconds here, Joseph, but do you think there'll be some more about because it seems like they're almost going away from the relationship, the prosecution, so we may even get a little less.
I think we're going to get a little less. I think the prosecution even intimated to the court they're not seeking to elicit the information regarding the Aruba trip. And just to your last point, I think the defense did what they had to do and navigate away from coming across as insensitive to John O'Keefe. He's not that type of victim that you attack his character in front of the jury. You win no points by doing that.
Yeah, and again, I say it every time. Like, everything we've heard about him is nothing but positive, and the way he, stepped up in the midst of that incredible family tragedy, and now this family has a second tragedy that they're dealing with. All right, our guests are staying with us. Wayne Dennis and Joseph Kraske, they're going to join us in a little bit. Up next, what is the connection between John O'Keefe and the Bryans? I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe. Crucial to this case is figuring out what caused John's injuries, getting hit by a car or a brutal attack. The first jury couldn't figure it out. Here's the story. On January 29th, 2022, Karen Reed discovered the lifeless body of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, in a snowbank outside of a fellow officer's home in Canton, Massachusetts. Prosecutors allege that Reed, after a night of drinking, struck O'Keefe with her SUV and left him to die in the blizzard. She faces charges of second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence, and leaving the scene of personal injury and death. Reed has pleaded not guilty, asserting that she's being framed by law enforcement to shield others involved in O'Keefe's death. Her first trial ended in a mistrial in July of 2024 due to a hung jury. The retrial is underway amid heightened public interest and scrutiny over investigative conduct, including the dismissal of lead investigator Trooper Michael Proctor for unprofessional behavior. This case has now become a focal point of discussions about justice and police accountability. So when you talk about the death of John O'Keefe, there's a series of events that take place that night. And there's several factors involved, and there's stops at a couple of different bars in downtown Canton, Massachusetts. So what exactly were the plans, and how does John O'Keefe end up where he ends up? It's an important part of trying to figure all of this out. I want you to take a listen to the testimony of a man named Chris Albert. Chris Albert owns a pizzeria in downtown Canton, and it's right next door to one of the bars that John O'Keefe was at, and across the street from the other. There's a bunch of things on that main street in downtown Canton. Take a listen to his testimony about his communications with John O'Keefe that day.
I said, but it's my nephew's birthday, and I know a bunch of people are heading out, and I was planning on meeting up with them later when I got out of work. So I think I said to him, I said to him, I'll shoot you a text later if you're around. Maybe we can hook up. Then I shot him a text, I think, when I got down to Waterfall, and I said, where are you? And go ahead. Sorry.
And where did he say that he was?
He was at CF McCarthy's.
Okay, so that's Chris Albert, right? Chris Albert isn't at 34 Fairview that night for the after party, but I guess he does see him downtown that night in the Waterfall Bar. So Chris Albert's significance sort of gets things into motion. But then, from the defense perspective and what they've alleged here, in terms of who was the one responsible for the death of John O'Keefe, they've mentioned Chris's brother, Brian Albert, and they've also mentioned Brian Higgins, both of whom are also in law enforcement. So we saw the connection here between John O'Keefe and Chris Albert, and that brings us to the next question in our investigation, which is, what is the connection between John O'Keefe and the Bryans? Brian Albert, the owner of the house, Brian Higgins. Here with us, YouTuber, author of the book Storm of Suspicion, the Karen Reed Trials, Kevin Lenahan, and Karen Reed supporter and creator of the Justice for Officer John O'Keefe and Karen Reed Facebook page, Nick Rocco. Okay, Kevin, I'll start with you. How would you describe the connection that John O'Keefe has to the Bryans? Let's start with Brian Albert. They're both Boston police officers, aren't they?
Well, actually, maybe we should start with Chris, the person you just showed there, because Chris owned a home just a couple houses down from John. So they were neighbors. They were close neighbors. And one of the things that came out in the trial was that when they went on vacation, John left instructions for Chris Albert and his wife to keep an eye on their house. So they went and took some pictures playing around out front of the house. So they did have a somewhat close enough friendship to at least have that kind of thing. So the defense has tried to, in order to try to stitch together this third-party culprit theory that they've tried to kind of craft like Stephen King, they had to come up with a motive. And they've never been able to couple the motive because there's no history of animosity between the Alberts and John O'Keefe at all. John didn't really know Brian Albert, but he was friendly enough with Detective Kevin Albert of the Canton Police that when there was someone dealing drugs in the neighborhood, he had Karen take a video of that, and they sent that to Kevin Albert. So, and that day, it's at D&E Pizza, Chris Albert's Pizzeria, that John takes his nephew there for lunch, and that's when Chris invites them out to go out later. So these people, there's no animosity. There's nothing but basically friendship there, and the only animosity is something that's invented for the sake of telling a story.
Nick Rocco, let me ask you about the connection. How would you describe the connection between John O'Keefe and the Bryans?
All right, so I'll answer the question for you. So basically, Brian Albert is a high-ranking Boston police officer. John O'Keefe is also a Boston police officer. At this time, he's in the sex crime unit. And basically, if you're on Brian Albert's good side, you have a leg up in the Boston Police Department. You could potentially move up the rankings a little faster. But a lot of people also feared Brian Albert working in the same police department as him. As we see, there are a few witnesses on the defense witness list that Brian Albert, had a scuffle with. And when it comes to Brian Higgins, they were more friendly acquaintances, but the real connection of the friendship lies between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins. As we know, they went down to New York together. They came home together the same day. They were drinking all day. They went to a few bars before they ultimately met up at the Waterfall Bar again. And to the Chris Albert point, one thing I think a lot of people need to remember about Chris Albert, in his initial police report, he said he went to 34 Fairview Road. He said he followed them to 34 Fairview Road. Then all of a sudden, that went out the window and he walked home. So that's why a lot of these stories are hard to believe, because the police reports say one thing, but the testimony says another thing. And Hank Brennan also said in his own words in the Whitey Bulger case, if the police reports don't match up to the witness testimony, we have a problem here.
All right, I want to take a listen to Brian Higgins, a piece of his testimony talking about what happened between him and Karen Reed.
The defendant kissed me.
And how did she kiss you?
Not like a friend.
Lip to lip, is that fair to say?
Yes.
Like a romantic kiss?
That's the way I interpreted it. I was physically attracted to her, yes.
Sexually attracted to her was my question.
Well, I think in the text I said, you're hot.
Okay. So my question again, Mr. Higgins, you seem to not want to answer my question. My question is, were you or were you not sexually attracted to my client?
Yes.
The real deal was what? What did you mean by I want the real deal?
Like a relationship.
Okay, Nick, so Higgins knows that Karen is with John. Does John know that Karen had been flirting or kissed Brian Higgins?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if John knew anything about the relationship. I don't know if he saw text messages or, you know, if he heard rumors about things. I can't answer that question. I have no idea, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I do. But if he did find out about that, that would be animosity between the two of them, which then could potentially lead to a fight over Karen.
Kevin Lenahan, what do you think about the Higgins Karen Reed kiss and how it impacts the dynamic between John O'Keefe and the Bryans?
Well, there's no evidence that that John O'Keefe was aware of any of that. And in fact, if you watch the video of the waterfall when John and Karen arrive, John makes a beeline over and gives a big hug to Brian Higgins. So there doesn't seem to be any animosity there. You know, it was, I think Brian Higgins understandably would regret doing that. But what he's also trying to, when he's going, he doesn't understand, it's Karen that initiates the relationship with him, this flirtatious relationship, and it's out of the blue. And he's and so Brian is interested because she's an attractive woman, but at the same time, he doesn't want to cheat on someone he considers a friend. They're not old friends or anything like that, but still, that's not the image that he sees of himself. So he's trying to feel it out and say, all right, are you guys ending your relationship? So he's willing to maybe do something with her, but only if she's at the point of ending her relationship with John. And so, you know, we don't know what Karen's motivations were for doing any of this. Try not to get in their heads. She stopped that textual flirting about a week beforehand. And, you know, there's no indication. I don't know. There's no real reason to believe that Brian felt that much of an obsession with Karen that it would become a motive to murder someone.
Nick, we have about 30 seconds left here. Your thoughts about how this is going to play out in the trial. John O'Keefe, Brian Higgins, Brian Albert. And do you think that the defense is going to put a lot of focus on what is going on that night between these three?
Yeah, I personally don't think that these text messages between Brian Higgins is a great look for either side, but I think they kind of wash each other out because the defense can use it in the sense of his motive for, you know, Brian Higgins to do something, and the prosecution's going to say, look, here's a motive. She didn't like him anymore, so that's why she killed John O'Keefe. I think both, they kind of outweigh each other in a sense. So I personally don't think it's that big of a deal in this upcoming trial. But one thing, you know, I am also glad to see some of those billboards go up that do remember John O'Keefe because, you know, the Free Karen Reed side has not forgotten about John O'Keefe. And I know it may come off that way on some things, but we all do want justice for John O'Keefe. But we see it as, you know, Karen Reed needs to be freed before John can really get justice.
Nick Rocco, Kevin Lenahan, always appreciate it. Big trial coming up, and you'll be with us throughout, so we really thank you. Still to come, how far will the defense go in their opening statement? Daybell.
Already convicted for the murders of her children.
Doomsday Cult mom is now lawyer Lori.
She's representing herself.
On charges of conspiring to murder her fourth husband.
She said, I can murder you now.
She really thinks she's equipped to try this case.
She appears very sure of herself.
I have real trial experience.
It's going to be a strange trial. We'll see how it plays out.
The Cult Mom Conspiracy Trial. Live coverage continues Monday morning on Court TV.
Do you have an opinion with regard to the nature and source of the wounds on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
Those wounds were inflicted by a dog attack.
That was Dr. Russell, who testified in the first trial as an expert for the defense on dog bites and dog scratches and dog marks. And she'll be testifying in the second trial for the defense as well. And it's all about the wounds on John O'Keefe's arm. And this became a very big piece of the defense in this case, talking about those wounds and where they came from. There was a dog in 34 Fairview, dog named Chloe, and the defense has for years said that Chloe had something to do with the attack on John O'Keefe. But I want you to take a look at this. This is a motion regarding the opening statement of the defense. It's a motion by the prosecution to limit what they can say. The Commonwealth moves for an order that the defense counsel refrain from claiming in their opening statement that any of the victim's injuries were caused by any person or animal, meaning Chloe, that was inside the home at 34 Fairview Road. Based on the defense's request to show the abrasions to the victim's arm in their opening statement, the Commonwealth notes that the court has ruled the defense is precluded from mentioning any reference to third-party culprit claims prior to establishing a viable basis supported by admissible evidence, and any mention of third-party culprit claims relative to the abrasions would be improper. Is talking about a dog a third-party culprit? I guess. But here they are trying to limit how far the defense can go in their opening statement, which brings us to the next question in our investigation. How far will the defense go in their opening statement? Where are they going to take this jury in their first opportunity to address them directly about the facts of the case? Here with us, Massachusetts trial attorney who served as special counsel to Johnny Depp in his defamation case, Wayne Dennison, and Massachusetts criminal defense attorney Joseph Krowski Jr. Wayne, what do you think? Where are they going? Are they going to fight for their right to inculpate Chloe in their opening?
Yeah, they will fight for that right. In fact, what openings are supposed to be is a preview of the evidence that's ultimately they hope to put in front of the jury. And if they have a credible basis for that evidence, they should be able to preview it. Remember, in the first trial, they came out of the box hard. And they had the same ruling about third-party culprit. But the first thing Yannetti said was Karen Reed was framed. And I think they're going to push this envelope as hard as they can possibly push this envelope over and over and over again.
Okay, you mentioned it. I got to show it to the folks at home. Let's take one more look at that strong open where they were going all in during Karen Reed's first trial. Here's David Yannetti.
Karen Reed was framed. Her car never struck John O'Keefe. She did not cause his death, and that means that somebody else did. You will learn that it was no accident that John O'Keefe was found dead on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road in Canton on January 29th of 2022. You will learn that at that address lived a well-known and well-connected law enforcement family in Canton, the Alberts. Because the Alberts were involved, and because they had close connections to the investigators in this case, Karen Reed was framed for a murder she did not commit.
All right, Joseph, what are your thoughts about how the defense is going to approach this time around?
Well, you remember there was a pretrial ruling that the defense was not supposed to mention third-party culprit in their opening, and David Yannetti, and sometimes, again, it's better to ask for forgiveness, came out strong with it. But I think because there's a track record of violating that order, they're going to be on a little bit better behavior. Now, there is a ruling out there from Judge Cannoni that third-party culprit cannot be brought up unless it's developed at trial. So I'm not so sure they're going to be permitted to open with it. As it relates to Chloe the dog, that's still outstanding. That issue hasn't been resolved. I'm sure the court is going to email the attorneys this weekend. And I think from the Commonwealth's perspective is what they're saying is that without the third-party culprits of Brian Higgins and Brian Albert, there's no relevance to Chloe. No one's suggesting that those injuries on the arm were the actual cause of death. But I would imagine that Judge Cannoni's probably going to allow them to show that picture and argue that they are from a dog bite. And the reason I say that is because she did allow them to call Garrett Wing, their new so-called dog bite expert, at trial to testify as to causation of those injuries.
So, looking at how they play it, right? If they're a little less aggressive than they were last time, will it be more? Is it possible that we'll get more of a they can't prove this type of open? Wayne, do you think they could do that and lean more on Trooper Proctor and talk about the investigation and really steer the jury that way from the outset if they don't go into the she got framed third-party area and kind of lean on this is a worst investigation ever and you can't trust anything?
I can't imagine they wouldn't try to do both things at once. They will talk about how bad this investigation was, that there was no real effort to determine any other culprit but Karen Reed, and I think that that will be part of the opening. As a matter of courtesy and practice, people don't generally object to openings, but there is an opportunity if they get far afield to get a sustained objection, and that really does muck up the works when you're trying to open your case.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Joseph. The way these teams have battled and how aggressive they are, and it's really like a bunch of defense attorneys going after each other. Yeah, they all have prosecution experience as well. At least Jackson does and Brennan does. But are you going to see, do you think, more aggressive lawyering during the course of even these opening statements?
Oh, I absolutely think so. And Yannetti has prosecution experience too. Look, you can tell the temperature of the room. These are experienced lawyers. These are all tough lawyers. I would say, I think to the viewing public, they probably think that these lawyers don't like each other, but they're competitive and they're doing the job to the best of their abilities. I think there's a lot of mutual respect between the lawyers, but I think Attorney Brennan, the difference will be is he's going to be a lot more aggressive in his objections. And I think about retooling the case, he's going to try to prove the case, not disprove a defense theory. And I think that's the biggest distinction you'll see. But
I think that'll be huge.
Alan Jackson's got a big personality, but so does
I do it to you every time, Joseph. It's like a little routine we have. We're out of time. Thanks so much, Joseph Krowski Jr., Wayne Dennison. You know, this case will actually be bigger the second time around. Do this. Check in on social media. Everyone is talking about it, including the Real Housewives. That level of attention didn't happen first time around. Now the question is, will that impact any of the players involved? Will the attorneys feel the pressure or rise to the occasion? I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep searching for the answers as the investigation continues.